I want to thank everyone for being there at this webinar, Author Meets Critics, jointly hosted by CRIMT, which is the Interuniversity Research Center on Globalization and Work and its partnership project, and the Canadian Industrial Relations Association, Association Canadienne de Relations Industrielles. We are sponsoring this because we thought that there was an important publication which merited this kind of format and that it would be a lot of fun to do it. And we're very fortunate to have with us the author of this study, Jobs with Inequality, a nice cover. And the subtitle is Financialization, Post-Democracy, and Labour Market Deregulation in Canada. And the author is John Peters. It was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2022. So it's available for purchase or to be consulted in local libraries. And it's an important study of key trends taking place over the last several decades to do with clearly financialization, but the implications of this in multiple ways for the labor movement, for labor market regulation and deregulation, and for democracy. Now, John Peters is a associated professor at the School of Industrial Relations at the University of Montreal. Need I say that he's also a refugee from Laurentian University and the cancellation of its labor studies program. John is also teaching at the University of Toronto at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources on their climate crisis and the future of work course, summer school course, and has done so likewise at Université de Montréal. And he's involved in a range of initiatives around climate change and through blue-green ideas, of which he's the executive director. Now we have three critics, and we're really spoiled by the three critics. Those are Judy Fudge, who is the I have to get the name correct, Judy, the Leona Enrico Henry Mancinelli Professor in Global Labor Issues in the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. We have Ian MacDonald, who is a professor in the School of Industrial Relations at Université de Montréal. And we have Jim Stanford, who is the director of the Center for Future Work, which I believe is simultaneously based in Vancouver and Sydney. So we have a great panel. The format is as follows. John is going to give an initial presentation of the arguments in the book, and then we'll ask in a series of back and forth with the critics, first of all, something about a key takeaway from the book, and then we'll ask them to develop their thoughts by focusing on three observations, and eventually we'll have some of the challenges that flow from this, and then a response from John. So thanks everyone for being there. As I repeat, this is a Author Meets Critics of Jobs with Inequality. It's going to last for an hour and a half, and note that it's being taped. So if you if you want to contribute, you should know that, and we need your consent for this. So many thanks for everyone for being there, and thanks also to Nicolas Roby, for the scientific coordinator of CRIMT, for helping to make this happen. So over to you, John Peters, for a first 10 minutes on the core arguments in the book.
Thanks so much, Gregor. Really appreciate it. And thanks so much to Jim and Judy and Ian for agreeing to participate in the discussion about my book and talking about inequality in Canada and what its causes are, and why the economy no longer works for the vast majority of Canadians, and what are the, perhaps ways that we might be able to begin to think about changing this. So I think, like many, in terms of inequality, everyone's attention was focused with the first financial crisis of 2008 and 2010. And in the wake of that, we had Occupy Wall Street, and huge protest movements around the world about the 99% versus the 1%, and why it looked like the 1% was not only the cause of the financial crisis, but they were also seemingly like the major beneficiaries of it at the same time. And it was in that wake that we have seen so much more inequality research taking place on both an international level by the World Inequality Lab in Paris, by international researchers, people using tax data, people using labor market surveys, people using new kinds of consumer surveys, and all sort of thinking about what and how is it that we got ourselves into such a mess, and what is it that might get us out. And much of the focus has been on these sort of the key transformations of our economy and of our democracy and of our public policies, and how so often these have favored big business and the very wealthy and the very few, and they've really been sort of key in concentrating income gains at the very top. And so in the wake of that crisis and seeing this research coming forward, I sort of thought, well, I want to dig into what's happening in Canada, because it seems like many of those similar sorts of trends are there. And I think, like many researchers, and I think like sort of most Canadians, we have a sort of sense that, the inequality is going up, and that that's sort of the rungs between, the haves and the have-nots are expanding. But I think once sort of looking at the numbers and really getting into the tax data, then it wasn't just about, your usual run-of-the-mill inequality. It was the sort of stratospheric rise of the very, very, very few and the very, very top of the top 1%, and in fact, the top 1/10 of 1%, and even fewer at the top 1/100th of 1%. At the very, we're talking about roughly 1,300 families. And the income gains that they showed, of 275% or more, right, over that course of the 1990s and 2015s, where I just thought completely astonishing. And so when I had this tax data, I couldn't believe it, right? And I remember having the discussions with Stats Canada, with some of the tax researchers there, and saying, no, we have to run this again. We have to look at this again and try to figure this out. And so, yes, sure enough, yes, that was exactly what we're looking at, both before and after. We ran it median incomes, average incomes, capital gains, no capital gains, those who have income, those who don't, right? So we looked at it pretty carefully. So then I thought, well, what's happening then at the bottom? And then again, I was completely astonished and saddened and depressed, and also, very curious. How is it that so many Canadians, roughly up to 50% of Canadians, even in their families, and those especially in non-standard workers, are just making essentially, in comparison, pennies. Even by 2015, you're looking at a rough average family income for the bottom 50% of households, of $18,000 for market income. And, you add a few transfers to that, and you're roughly around 25,000. And so those numbers really sort of began to drive my research agenda when I began to see that, and sort of looking at what the sort of common explanations are, whether that's, sort of technology or globalization or education or immigration. But the more you sort of looked at each of those explanations for our typical understandings of inequality, the sort of standard ones that we use and often are used to, devise our policies for good or for ill, none of them really seem to work very well. Certainly, you can't explain how is it that the very top 1% have more, 275% more education than everybody else. And you certainly can't understand it when, roughly more than 50% of the workforce have some sort of degree of post-secondary education or college education, which is amongst some of the highest amongst advanced industrial countries. Trade, similarly, countries that have more trade, Sweden and Denmark, have very much more exposed economies to globalization, and yet they have almost none of this sort of top-end inequality, and they have almost no low-wage work across their workforces. So I was really taken with other kinds of research that are saying, well, what's happening in terms of how our economy actually functions, and what kinds of policies might explain how our economy functions? And looking at what is it that explains why business and finance have grown so exponentially over the past few decades. And this is where sort of critical political economists have really begun to dig in and use these kinds of terms, whether that's financialization or whether that's the globalization of corporate firms and corporate governance, or the development of global value chains. Well, all of that, I think, really sort of begins to sort of give you a better sense about, why is it that, companies and business become even bigger. They are, taking in more wealth. So that's one part of it. But of course, lots of labor researchers at the same time are also dealing and detailing the nature of what's happening to our labor laws and to our employment standards, and how there's fewer and fewer people covered by collective agreements, especially in both Canada and the United States. Employment standards are not being revised, are not being improved, or minimum wages are left being frozen for years on end. And in some cases, basic sorts of rights at work in terms of, say, overtime or sick days or any kinds of leaves, all of this is simply not being, allowed for workers in any way, shape, or form. So you begin to sort of dive into all these things that happen before distribution takes place and before taxation takes place. Well, it's really sort of these kinds of discrepancies that you see how these policies over the course of this period really are, transformed. And you, as a researcher, you compile all these lists of changes, whether that's to pensions or whether that's to banking and financial regulations, whether that's to trade and investment policies, that's to taxation and tax treaties. We'll look at all the changes that are happening to labor certifications and the lack of enforcement on employment standard violations. And you look at it and you think, well, how is it that we can begin to explain all of these kinds of transformations that seem to favor business and the very wealthy, but don't seem to do anything at all, and in fact make conditions worse, or certainly make wages stagnate over the course of, of 2+ decades. Why is it, and how does that take place? Well, Colin Crouch, I think, is a British social scientist who's been looking at many of these things, and I was quite taken with a lot of his research over years, and I thought his term of post-democracy was very apt in sort of beginning to understand and provide a framework for sort of thinking about how all these policy changes are taking place and why they're only continuing to favor a very few, and especially favor big business and big finance. And what he argues is that, to understand sort of not only sort of neoliberalism, you also have to understand how is it that our governments have been changed and significantly changed, and our policymaking has been changed over the past, decades, from the late 20th century and now into the 21st. And what he talks about is not only this sort of organizational transformation of business power and business influence and the influence of money on politics, but also how, as that takes place, governments themselves and politicians and political parties all turn their attention much more to the interests of the rich and the very powerful, and begin to sort of cater policy and devise policy that is much more along those lines, and don't necessarily have to take in the interests or the concerns of the vast majority of the electorate anymore, and can use that money as ways to be reelected. So I began to sort of really look at that and what that actually meant for things like the nature of debt markets and credit markets, and how financial markets work, and also then how companies can begin to work. And I also began to look at that kind of framework for how post-democracy can help us understand all the kinds of different changes or pattern of changes, or the nature of changes and the scale of changes and reforms and lack of enforcement to our labor laws and employment standards. And when you began to look at that, then you began to have a sort of an idea that post-democracy in this sense also sort of starts off, as always, as we sort of know, is that business has had tremendous amounts of power over the past century, and that democracy is always, and workers and citizens and union groups have all tried to sort of fight back and gain. But now, over the past few decades, that whole balance of power, I think, has begun to shift in the opposite direction with these kinds of changes. And I think some of that was incremental first, in terms of changes to sort of trade policy and to taxation, but then it becomes more and more self-reinforcing over time as we gain changes to pensions and to banking regulation, and to corporate and global growth, which relies more and more upon financial and debt markets, and more on financial priorities of short-term profits for short-term gains, and using that as a way to boost their dividends and boost immediate returns at the cost of actual investment in jobs in the wider economy. So all of that happens, then it seems to me kind of creates that sort of vicious downward cycle of post-democracy and of financialization of firms and businesses and finance getting bigger, all for their own interest and for their own profits, but at the cost of everybody else, at the cost of our economy, at the cost of our wages, at the cost of our job quality, and at the very cost of equality. And as that takes place, then unsurprisingly, the money that's gained in the markets by big business and the wealthy then becomes a major resource to change the nature of politics and to change the nature of political power as well. And all of that's very depressing. And I think, you can also see how that model of post-democracy and financial power and labor market deregulation even continues to take place now over the most recent COVID crisis, where we've seen billionaire wealth in the midst of one of the worst economic crises that we've seen, as well as the worst health crisis we've seen since the early 20th century, lead to, billionaires in Canada, increasing their wealth by more than 50% and roughly $248 billion. Just over in the course of a couple of years. And at the same time, then any of the good policies like the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit or the wage subsidies that were there are immediately all canceled for workers, with the sort of waiving of some of the major health concerns and the health crisis itself. So thinking about what's happened, and why it's happening and why we're not seeing, major changes and pushbacks, to the kind of inequality crisis that we're facing are all key problems that I've really wanted to try to attend to. And it's not a most optimistic book, and it's a long book, and that's a big story to try and tell, but I think it's an important story to try and tell. I think thinking about how capitalism has changed, what it's meant for democracy, what it's meant for our labor markets, what it's meant for our basic democratic rights at work, all of these things I think we really have to sort of begin to pay attention to and pay close attention to. And I think if there is a message that is an optimistic one, is that if politics got us into this mess and is a reason for this kind of vast inequality and many problems that it caused, then I think it's also politics, and it's the involvement of our workers and the involvement of our labor markets and of our trade unions in our labor markets, and the involvement of citizens mobilizing against that can also solve it. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in terms of the climate crisis, because it doesn't matter whether you're, extraordinarily wealthy or part of the ultra rich, or whether you're an immigrant laborer, everyone is affected by the climate crisis. And the kind of politics and the kinds of policies we're going to need mean that we have to create a new kind of government, and a far more democratic one, if we're actually going to resolve this and save all of our collective resources and our collective well-being in the long term. So that's some of the basics of the book, and I'd certainly like to hear what Jim and Judy and Ian have to say, and have a discussion about, both about some of the nature of some of those explanations, but also about some of the ways that we may be able to get out of that mess that we're currently in. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. That's a terrific entry. By way of reminder, I'm Gregor Murray, and I'm moderating this discussion on behalf of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association and CRIMT, the Interuniversity Research Centre on Globalization at Work. We are discussing Jobs with Inequality, a 2022 publication, the University of Toronto Press, authored by John Peters. And we are very fortunate to have a terrific panel of discussants of this book, of which Judy Fudge from McMaster, Jim Stanford from the Centre for Future Work, and Ian MacDonald from the Université de Montréal. And the way that we've asked the critics to intervene is in a series of responses to questions. And the first one is meant to be a quick round and to say, okay, what's your main takeaway from this book, the key takeaway that you have? And this is there are 2-minute rounds. So we'll start with Judy and then go over to Jim and then over to Ian. And then we'll go for some more substantive remarks on the key points that they want to make about the book. So Judy Fudge, McMaster University, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gregor, and thanks also to you and your great crew at CRIMT and to CIRA for co-sponsoring the panel that you've organized, for John's great new book on jobs with inequality. You do a great job, Gregor, at facilitating important conversations about how to make work better for the majority of people. I'd also really like to thank John for putting in the very hard work to write such a good book. I've already used it when I've had to talk about different kinds of things, so it's a great resource. It's also theoretically fluent, and it's really empirically rich and rigorous. It's a daunting project. So for me, the most important thing about the book is it provides the best discussion of economic inequality in Canada, which is appalling both in comparative and absolute terms. It clearly demonstrates that economic inequality is not inevitable. It is the result of a series of decisions and choices made over decades. Now, Canadians tend to think of ourselves as really good people, guided by equity and justice. John clearly shows, using a range of different measures, that inequality has grown remarkably in Canada. In doing so, he lays to rest what are inaccurate and tired cliches. First, that under capitalism, wealth trickles down. It doesn't. As my good friend Harry Glassbeck always says, the problem is all the sponges on the top that soak up the value. And the second tired cliche he deals with is that a rising tide raises all boats. It doesn't just go to a place where there's big tides. Some boats get swamped and they're stuck at the bottom. The book is an important antidote to the smug idea that Canada is an equal society. And it also shows that inequality is not inevitable. It is the result of a series of political decisions to benefit the very few to the detriment of the many. So thank you, John. It's really timely.
Hey, thank you very much, Judy Fudge, for her first key takeaway from the book. And over to you, Jim Stanford in Vancouver. We wanted to make sure it was after 9 o'clock in the morning, so before you could speak. So there you are.
So considerate of you, Gregor. Thank you. Just more evidence of the thoughtfulness of your facilitating, that you think of us Westerners that way. I do want to echo Judy's comments of thanks to Gregor and your whole team at the remarkable role that you play facilitating a great network of progressive labor research in Canada and around the world. And very glad to participate today, as in anything that CRIMT does. And John, congratulations on this book. It's a real triumph. It's going to have a long shelf life. It's going to be a resource that people turn to time and time again as we confront the future crises of this system. If I was to list my major takeaway from the book, I would say it is the way that John has successfully weaved together three of the key different dimensions of this overall neoliberal strategy to reinforce the power of businesses and the wealthy people who own businesses. So, Judy has quite rightly just stressed the point that inequality is a deliberate policy outcome. It's a choice. It was a goal of neoliberalism, and in that regard, it's worked. And then what I'll add is that there's a multidimensional, but in some ways coherent strategy behind that overall effort to reinforce business power. And John has focused on three dimensions of that. One is obviously financialization and the increasing power and activity, some of it productive, much of it unproductive, of the broader financial system, and how that infiltrates all aspects of our life. He's also talked about what he calls labor market deregulation. I'll have more to say on that precise term, deregulation, later on. I think there's an interesting conversation to have there, but he's getting at the whole weakening of the post-war, more kind of generous or protective institutional frameworks that regulated work. And then third, of course, is the erosion of democracy in the political sphere, and all of the different ways that the always imperfect and incomplete nature of bourgeois democracy, even at the best of times, has been steadily chipped away. And the way that John brings these three things together shows in a way, the integrated and in some ways coherent nature of what we're up against here. That they have been pulling the strings in these three different areas to achieve that unified outcome of greater inequality. You could almost come away from it thinking that it was a conspiracy, that a bunch of rich people met in a castle somewhere in France, maybe, and came up with a plan for how to do this. And you know, I learned long ago, Gregor, that just because I'm paranoid, okay, it doesn't mean they're not following me. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're considering the potentially conspiratorial nature of it. And of course, it wasn't a conspiracy, but there was thought, and there was thought leadership and planning that went into this multidimensional attack. And I think that the holistic nature of John's treatment of these different strands of neoliberal strategy is very powerful, and something that I will take away from the book.
Thank you, Jim Stanford. And just be careful of that neoliberal shadow behind you, will you? You'll have to turn around quickly, but we can all see it. And we're going to have a second round, which is some of the key observations that you want to share about the book. And I'll set you up, Jim, that you'll be first up for the next round, and then followed by Ian and then Judy. But over to you, Ian MacDonald at the University of Montreal, for your initial reaction, your key takeaway to this book.
Thanks, Gregor, and thanks, John, for writing this very impressive book that I struggled with for several days. I should also mention that it was beautifully turned out with a cover that really appeals to the urbanist in me. Lovely, lovely work. My takeaway: this is an attempt to put politics and power at the center of our understanding of rising inequality. There's a very nice critique of neoclassical explanations of wage inequality. And I appreciated the critique of the institutionalist accounts of varieties in capitalism that place too much importance on business associations and path dependency, and don't pay enough attention to the long-term effects of public policy, deregulation of finance and labor in particular, in shifting power away from workers to employers. And for me, that was the most important point in the book. It's also, of course, an attempt to center financialization in our account of why the quality of work has declined and inequality worsened. To be brutally brief, financial capitalism is bad, industrial capitalism was good, and policy changes in a context of declining democracy explains why we have the former rather than the latter. I don't know if that's the takeaway that you intended, John, but that's what I took from it. It's a complex argument, even before getting to the provincial comparison and the response of unions. It's exceptionally well researched. I think the most important contribution lies in showing how business organized in BC and Ontario to roll back labor and employment standards, and how business at both levels of the state have been successful in advancing their interests to the detriment of workers. This is important work, vital work, and I wish that political scientists did more of this kind of work. So that's all to the good. But this would be a much more interesting event if, instead of just agreeing with you, we challenge you on a few points. So that's what I'm going to do in the second round.
John Peters, you need to be duly prepared. Thank you very much. Just a reminder that you're listening to this discussion of Jobs with Inequality, a great book by John Peters, according to our initial round, published by the University of Toronto Press. In the second round, so we've asked people to make 2 or 3 observations. If you find that you're running up against your 5-minute window and you want to go for 2 rather than 3, that's okay. But you expressed a preference to put your thoughts together. So first of all, Jim Stanford, when you have to think about 2 or 3 observations about the book that you think are important, you want to share with the participants in this webinar, what are they?
Right, thank you. So one of them I've already hinted at when I interrogated the term labor market deregulation, which is the umbrella term that John uses to talk about all of the employer-friendly shifts in labor law, labor standards, workplace relations over the neoliberal era. And I'm just not convinced that deregulation is the appropriate term. Now, I know it's commonly invoked to describe that whole sort of neoliberal shift in labor policy and the abandonment of proactive measures to protect workers and achieve a more equal distribution. But the more I think of it, and I've used that term myself a lot in the past, but the more I think of it, I think it's wrong. And one of the reasons I came across this was my time in Australia. Gregor, you know, I worked there and we met down there. They have an intensely regulated system of industrial relations in Australia. It is ridiculously micromanaged. There's a Fair Work Act that has 1,000 pages in it and thousands more of detailed regulations and instructions telling what people can do and what they can't do, especially a lot on what they can't do, right down to the topics that are allowed to be raised in the course of collective bargaining. And I think Australia is a unique case in that regard, but it's true everywhere else, including in Canada. And it is not so much, in my judgment, that the state is stepping back from trying to regulate labor markets with a particular goal, but it's a question of now using what tools and in whose interest is it being re-regulated. And we see this all over the place in terms of obviously government level labor policy, social policy, tax policy, other things that are all aimed at trying to reinforce the so-called incentive to work and reduce the competition for labor from other sources. We see it obviously within workplaces. Look at the spread of digital surveillance and monitoring techniques within businesses nowadays. I think it's an underbelly of the whole AI and digitalization phenomenon that we're experiencing. So I think that labor markets are intensely regulated, and I wonder if collectively we might have some discussion about that. A second observation I had, John, was in terms of your effort to link financialization with what has happened in the labor market, whether we call it deregulation or call it something else. I think that was really important and very valuable. I wonder if there's one piece that I think you could elaborate on more, perhaps in future work, and that is the tie to monetary policy and the shift in monetary policy at the beginning of the neoliberal era. I think that the abandonment of full employment as a macroeconomic goal and the adoption of what was originally called the natural rate hypothesis, that you have to maintain unemployment at a certain level. Now they use the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NIRU, as the gobbledygook synonym for what is essentially the natural rate of unemployment, or someone else once called it the reserve army of labor. At any rate, that idea that they are going to consciously maintain a pool of desperate workers in order to suppress wage demands and discipline workers. I believe that shift in monetary policy was key in setting the stage for financialization, because now you had deliberately tight reins on the overall macroeconomy, including its productive side, but all kinds of opportunities arising in the paper economy or the financial side for all of the speculation. And given that the original shift in monetary policy was all about regulating labor markets, again, we come back to that point, they are actually trying to hit a certain unemployment rate in the whole economy. There's nothing more powerful as a tool of regulation and more ambitious as a goal of regulation than what monetary policy is trying to do. And I think that a very strong link could be made to connect the dots between that shift in monetary policy and then the changes in labor markets, which you exhaustively document. The final third point I'll throw in, Gregor, this post-democracy idea. I think you're onto something here, John, and you were ahead of your time, because I know you were researching this book years ago, and now we're in a moment where the crisis in democracy is accelerating, and the risk to democracy and the risk to workers if we lose the democracies that the democratic rights and spaces that we've fought for over the years, the risks are just so intense with the rise of explicitly anti-democratic right-wing forces, including in Canada. So you did mention that this book was depressing, and that was the part that I found the most depressing, because I'm really worried about what that means. And I wondered if, in the course of the discussion, John, you might expand on, because I know you've finished this manuscript at least a couple of years before Poilievre became Conservative Party leader. But I wonder if you would expand on the importance of that dimension of your work, given these anti-democratic threats that we're clearly facing.
Thank you very much, Jim Stanford. First point is that if someone had wanted to read more about monetary policy, what book would they consult in its most recent edition? I'm thinking of Stanford author.
Well, we, in a way, John and I cover similar ground. Frankly, you're referring very generously to Economics for Everyone, and that also tried to develop a multidisciplinary or multidimensional history of neoliberalism and how all the bits fit together, including the monetary policy side. So, thank you, Gregor, for that free plug. For the next beer is on me.
Right. And John, you're going to make us all more cheerful by seeing how absolutely depressing you can be. That's the invitation by Jim for the third point. But over to you, Ian MacDonald at Université Montréal. If you had to make 3 observations about the book, what would they be?
Well, as forewarned, here are some critical questions more than observations, John. My first question, how are you theorizing financialization? I asked the question because the book cites Arrighi, Harvey, Panchin, Ginden, and Lapavitsas, but also Epstein, Stockhammer, and Stiglitz. And this is not one big happy family. So is the book a critique of the financialization of the economy, or is it a critique of finance capitalism? And this isn't a semantic issue, but it's division between one school that sees finance emerging from the growth and crisis of post-war capitalism, finance being a symptom of decay and decline, aided by policy, but emerging out of the logic of capital accumulation. And the other is a story about deregulation, where finance was repressed, which was all to the good, and then for political reasons, it was unleashed. It's a story about bad actors and bad policy. So if we're dealing with an evolution within capitalism, then that leads to very different political conclusions. Banking and corporate governance reforms are not going to cut it. So where do you stand? And please don't say all of the above. Related to this point, because I'm afraid that you're going to do that. Related to this point, since I adopt a more Marxist view, I wonder if you're overstating the autonomy of the political. In your model of financialization, you list policy reforms as causes of financialization, and you discuss how Tory and Liberal governments push these through. If you take a comparative view of the politics of financialization, I think you find that deregulation was brought about as much by social democratic parties as by the traditional business-backed parties, and this is especially clear in Europe. It's not the case in Canada, because since Confederation, our business-backed parties have never lost power federally. So when finance was deregulated, of course, it was brought about by one of the business-backed parties. But if you look at France, it was François Mitterrand who deregulated banks in 1984. The Swedish banking sector was deregulated by Olaf Palme, of all people. In Germany, it was Schroeder who pushed Deutsche Bank to become the international criminal organization we know it to be today. So if we step back and ask ourselves, why do they do this? Putting aside ideology, because I don't think they were committed ideologues, like Thatcher or Reagan. It was an attempt to get their economies out of a deep crisis by reducing the cost of borrowing, expanding credit. And you can make the same point about neoliberal labor market reforms. I'll say reforms rather than deregulation, promoted as much by socialists and social democrats as by parties to their right. Indeed, this is why social democracy is a spent force in Europe. After 2 decades of liberalizing the labor market, the Socialist Party in France got 1.7% in the last presidential elections, and very well deserved in my view. So they were looking for a way to restart capitalist growth, and they chose the neoliberal model, which is based on cheap credit and cheap labor. So it's either that or challenging capitalism, and social democratic parties made the inevitable choice. So the book is about Canada, but returning to Canada, if the NDP had been in power in the 1990s, would they have been the only social democratic party in the advanced capitalist world to choose a different growth model?
Ian, did you want to stop there or make any further points?
could go I could go on. I have a question about labor. We haven't talked about labor response yet, and it's an important part of the book. And John, the argument, just to summarize, especially in Ontario, but federally as well, the story is about labor's fragmented response. Now, I actually, it's a pessimistic book, I guess, but I actually think saying the problem is labor fragmentation is optimistic of you. You're saying that labor's political effectiveness is less than the sum of its parts. But even if we have a positive sum, I think the greater challenge is just the poor effectiveness of labor's political efforts and strategies. And behind that is the question of legitimacy. I don't think unions are considered legitimate anymore when they endorse candidates and ask for their members to vote the union line. That's clearly the case in Quebec. I think it's the case in the rest of Canada as well. So more than fragmentation, I think the problem is building up political capacities. And I don't even think that's the first question, because I think the prior challenge is organizing and winning. I think politics, a better politics, labor politics, would follow from a more militant and better organized labor movement. So I was curious to know what you think about that.
Well, John, you're making a note of all these questions. Of course, you'll have the opportunity to choose which ones you're actually going to answer. But thank you very much, Ian MacDonald from the University of Montreal, for these provocative and incisive observations. Over to you, Judy Fudge at the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University, for your set of observations that you want people to consider about the book.
Thank you, Gregor. I'm going to be mostly flattering, so you'll be happy, John, so we can end on this way. So this is great. The others are flattering and they have really important questions, and I do think they are. But I think you did a really good job, and I really urge people to read your discussion of financialization. It's true, the big question remains, but the actual detailed mechanisms are really important to see. And I think what was really good is that you managed to pull all of them together. So I think that is really important. What I would like to see perhaps is a bit of a cultural political economy, because how does financialization take root? And I think that has to do with the way we've sold it, as you have to invest in your pension and you need your house to increase in value. And there's a whole politics around, and I hate to say this, a Foucaultian understanding of how subjectivities get formed. And I think that's absolutely critical, is to see financialization as a process that operates at the macro level. I think you've done a great job. I think it works perfectly well, what you've discussed at the meso level, in terms of how it works from the corporation into labor market technologies. But I think around subjectivity is there we have to move to other theoretical capacities. But I think you do a brilliant job on the two realms. My second point is that it's an exemplary political economy. I remember when I was doing my thesis, I wanted to write what I called a Canadian political economy, and you have done what I see as a Canadian political economy coming out of that radical neo-Marxist tradition with Panich and Rhiannon Mahone and a range of people like that, and drawing on Colin Crouch. And I think you worked it well at both levels, in terms of Canada at a macro level comparatively in international terms. And I really also like the more detailed case studies of the three jurisdictions, where you're talking about the policies that implement neoliberal financialization and what you call labor market deregulation. And you talk about reform, and you use British Columbia as a way of unpacking the protective labor supports and implementing financialization and deregulation. Newfoundland is stasis, where things change, but you can hold on to the ship. And the third is drift, where there's a blocking of reforms. I might quibble a bit with drift because I think it ignores the significance of Harris. And Harris was significant both in changing the fundamentals of labor markets, but also in creating real opportunity for rent capture around financialization. Think of the privatization of long-term care homes, which is absolutely critical. And BC followed that, I think, and Harris led that. So I just think that something around some of the timing, right? But I think it's a brilliant book, and I only quibble.
Thank you so much, Judy. That, and you didn't want to add any other points at this point. Not that that's not sufficient. Now there's going to be a third round here, a quick third round. We're going to start with Ian and then go to Judy and then go to Jim. And that the question that we're asking is, what do you see as the research and strategic challenges that you take away from the book? And for everyone to be familiar with the way we've organized this, we're then going to ask John to provide some responses to the many points that have been made, but within reason, so that we can then open it up to a larger discussion and other people can make comments, ask questions, and the like. So straight over to you, Ian, as the strategic and research challenge that you take away from the book.
The part of the book that I found most fascinating, John, was your discussion of how financialization changes the politics of business and their preferences and the way they organize. And you do this around discussion of the labor market reforms in the 90s in Ontario and BC in particular. And I found myself wondering, I haven't done this kind of research, and I imagine that it's quite difficult to be able to determine the degree of financialization in different firms. I'm not sure if the data is available to be able to do this kind of fine-grained research, but I would like to know more about how financialization changes the political preferences of firms. And when we return to the case of Ontario, during the Harris years and also during the Wynne attempt at reform, how do we make sense of divisions between capital on these policy issues? Is financialization, however you want to define it, the key variable, or is it their labor model, intensive versus extensive use of labor? Is it domestic market orientation or export market orientation? There are these important differences, and I'm wondering to what extent more empirical research could get at how financialization explains those divisions.
Thank you very much, Ian MacDonald. Just a reminder that we're talking about jobs with inequality. It's going to be over to you, Judy, for a research strategic challenge that you take away from the book.
Yeah, I think your book poses kind of two major challenges, one theoretical and political, and they're related. Once the majority of people like us leave the labor market, so I'm talking about well-educated people who are unionized, right? Because it's mostly people in the public sector with tertiary educations who are over the age of 40, right? Once we leave the labor market, we're dependent on financialization, pensions, and our home equity, right? So if we don't want to go into a long-term care home when the next pandemic comes and we're stuck by ourselves, we better have enough equity in our homes, right, to be able to pay for either personal care or long-term care. So we're linked into that. Right? How do we de-link? I mean, how do we theorize this connection, right? At the micro level, because we're important, I think, in terms of how we vote, right? And I'm talking about we globally, I think, in that way in Canada. And secondly, how do we organize around this politically? Because this kind of self-interest is perfectly understandable, right? It permeates the labor movement, for example. Public sector unions are happy with the labor law status quo. They like exclusive representation. They are opposed to sectoral bargaining in most of Canada, right? Outside of Quebec. They don't like sectoral bargaining because it threatens them. They have a good deal right now. What do we do with construction unions like the union whose name I bear that support Doug Ford because he's going to build a lot of roads, and that's good for the majority of his male members, despite the fact that they might have 20,000 female members in social care who are subject to wage controls. So how do we talk about short-term interests and think about longer-term solidarity, both theoretically and politically?
The questions that you're getting are really easy, so we might not need
Yeah.
all the time. That was Judy Fudge from the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. And finally, over to Jim Stanford to complete our really astoundingly good sets of comments coming from our critics of jobs with inequality. Over to you, Jim Stanford in Vancouver.
Thank you, Gregor. Well, obviously, I was also attuned to the strategic challenge of organizing and resistance that Judy just touched on, so I'll second her motion on that one. For my contribution in this round, Gregor, I'll do maybe a somewhat more economic focused one that I think draws on actually the title of the book, John's title, Jobs with Inequality, because originally I was quite, in a way, intrigued by the title, and I'm sure you put a lot of thought into thinking that, because what you're bringing out here is the fact that the system can find an equilibrium where it does put people to work, but within a tightly governed framework, which ensures that the fruits of their labor are sponged upward, as Judy was saying earlier. And this is, I think, an important change in how neoliberalism has been governed. Originally, the weapon of high and persistent unemployment was used in the early decades of neoliberalism as a disciplining tool. That was the whole point of the Volcker shock and the abandonment of full employment as a macroeconomic goal. And then the theoretical justification for that in the form of what eventually became NAIRU, the NAIRU model, and inflation targeting around the NAIRU model. But over the decades of neoliberalism, as labor was structurally disempowered with many of the changes that John documents in the book in Canada's case, the people regulating the system figured out that they could loosen the reins a bit on that unemployment rate and allow the labor market to approach, nothing like full employment, not remotely, but a closer balance between labor supply and labor demand. And the way that was explained, how could the unemployment rate suddenly, eventually come down to levels well below what used to be considered to be the NAIRU without sparking this wage price spiral that they all feared? The way they explained that was to say, well, the NAIRU has fallen because of the structural and institutional changes that neoliberalism has wrought. And now we're in a situation, particularly since the pandemic, where employers are complaining everywhere about labor shortages. And the unemployment rate is, again, not anywhere near full employment. I think even the term labor shortage is an employer-centric term. Is 5% official unemployment. That much, again, 1 million or more in Canada underemployed, and at least that many on the fringes of the labor market and not counted in the statistics. So we're nowhere near full employment, but we are at a situation where the employers are complaining that it's harder to recruit and retain labor using the same practices that they had used before. And now we've got the Bank of Canada, after being very unconventional, first in the global financial crisis and then in the COVID pandemic, dusting off the old, very orthodox NAIRU textbook and saying explicitly, we have to raise unemployment. Tiff Macklem said explicitly, we are going to raise unemployment. Unemployment is too low, which is in a way saying the quiet bits out loud. So I'm interested, John, in a way spurred by your title. How long do you think this combination of relatively low unemployment rate with the other structural features of this version of neoliberalism, how long is that going to last? Or are we going to get back or head back towards a regime in which unemployment is deliberately maintained at a higher level, in which case you'll have to change the title of the book for your next edition?
So thank you very much, Jim Stanford at the Center for Future Work in Vancouver. John Peters, who is the author of Jobs with Inequality, now has a rich round of comments to which you're going to have to probably pick and choose some themes that you want to pick up from the comments. Can I just remind everyone that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions after John responds to this initial set of comments. So you can raise your hands and we'll take several at a time. And secondly, that anyone who wishes can raise a question in English ou en français. On va faire la facilitation linguistique. So you can intervene in the language of your choice. Over to you, John Peters, author of Jobs with Inequality.
Well, thanks so much, Jim and Judy and Ian, right, for both your lovely comments as well as for the questions, many of them tough, many of which I can say I don't have answers for. But on top of that, all those questions I think are in need of discussion, right? Whether that's about how we think about financialization and how it affects the nature of the labor market and the nature and the levels of unemployment, or how is it that financialization has changed business preferences, but also had this major role on politics and continues to do so? And then how do we think about getting out of this mess? If in fact, as Judy points out, workers are so tied to financial markets that they would be afraid of any kind of real challenge, radical or otherwise, to the nature of sort of political and economic power as currently exists, right? So all of those things are big, huge questions that we have to begin to talk about and begin to strategize about and begin to wrap our heads around. In terms of the framework, I guess I think I've learned so much from Jim about the paper economy. I've learned from Judy about how financialization does lead to changes to labor markets, as well as how businesses and labor try to operate in specific kinds of geographical settings from all of you, right? So you know some of these questions better than I. But in terms of sort of putting this book together, I think one of the things I was most interested in doing is taking some signposts and putting them up on the wall and saying, look, we have to begin to think about what finance means to our economy, what it means to our businesses, and what that then means to how businesses operate with labor. Similarly, then, what does it mean to have labor market deregulation? Jim is completely right that, it's not about getting rid of regulations. It's about changing the nature of regulation. But you need a term to talk about this. And international policy organizations and the policy wonk speak for the last few decades has been about deregulating labor markets, creating more flexible labor markets, lowering costs for employers, lowering disincentives, if you can believe it, for things like unemployment insurance or for public pensions, right, for workers, which all of create less, interest in being actively in the labor market. Well, that's the big framework term that we sort of use for thinking about trying to make those labor market challenges happen. And it has been, the main way of thinking, I think, for governments and policy officials in advanced industrial countries for the past 3+ decades. But I think when you begin to talk about this for critical political economists or for a more progressive politics, then you got to think about, well, how is it that we're getting these kinds of changes to capitalism and changes to our labor laws and changes to our labor markets, and all of them seem to be getting worse as opposed to better. And I think this actually gives us, a sense of sort of it's being overwhelming, but also a real sense of the positive is that it is something that's not inevitable. It's something that was created politically, and we can see how business was involved in doing this and how the wealthy have been involved in this. We can see how their influence on government has changed and how and why political parties have begun to change, whether it's Mitterrand in France in the 1980s, dealing with a financial crisis and then having to, deregulate and change the nature of many of the sort of credit and monetary policies they had, or whether it's massive changes to Canada's pension plan, which allows them to invest in private equity, into derivatives, into hedge funds, as a way of making more money for the pension plan. So yeah, so there's sort of these series of sort of incremental changes, but all of them are being politically driven by that sort of massive change of balance of power between capitalism and democracy. And I think what I really wanted to try and do was, get us sort of all sort of thinking about those big terms of financialization, of deregulation, and post-democracy, and beginning to sort of drive them home so that we don't just think there's something called neoliberalism out there, and that neoliberalism, the change of government to favor business over labor, takes place naturally, and it doesn't involve these massive changes to how our economy works, how our labor markets work, and how our political systems work. And I think that's really one of the sort of the key things that I wanted to try and push, was to say, look, we have to look seriously about how neoliberalism functions, what those big changes have been inside of neoliberalism, and how they explain what currently has transpired. And this then leads us to, some of the sort of the key things that Jim points out and Judy point out. How is it that more and more people are dependent upon the financial market, despite the fact about what it might mean to our labor market, or how more and more our major economic institutions, whether it's the central bank, whether it's our pension funds, are more and more dependent upon maintaining an economy that really runs on debt and credit, and on the fact that it's very few who are continuing to sort of benefit. So I think that's the sort of things in terms of research strategies, is that I think we need more kind of research in each of these areas to really get a sense about some of their interconnections, but also about how they're functioning, but also thinking about the solutions for them, right? How is it that we can get unions more involved in politics to begin to think about how they can not only organize, but also create a politics that's going to be more popular, right? Whether that's going to be something like climate jobs and climate investments and infrastructure, that's not only going to create new renewable energy jobs, for example, but it's going to create new union jobs in terms of the construction for it, right? And provides a key organizing tool. How is it that we can get more, people to support a progressive type of politics, by challenging the nature of wealth distribution and inequality? Well, taxation, I think, is the quickest solution and is the best solution, whether it's a wealth tax, whether it's a windfall profits tax, and say that we're going to take that money and we're going to invest it, in making a clean economy with good jobs and social protection and a good job guarantee for everybody. So I think one of the things I want us to sort of take away, I think, is to say that we have these big problems, but we can create solutions for them, because now we can begin to see them. We can begin to see some of the internal workings of what business operates. We can see some of those internal workings of how our political system now favors business and finance. And we can see some of those political challenges that labor faces. If we can do that, then I think this is what I want this book to do, is to try to drive that kind of conversation and think hard about some of the major challenges that we're facing in terms of our economy, in terms of our labor markets, and in terms of our democracy. If we have those conversations and begin to, and push these kinds of issues forward and some of the solutions, I think that would be the best benefit that I would hope for any conversation around Canada's current inequality crisis and some of the solutions that we might find to it.
Thank you very much, John Peters, author of Jobs with Inequality. Our panelists and our author, they've all been remarkably disciplined in giving pithy and incisive remarks, and that leaves some time for discussion. So we're open to taking questions. Our critics should also feel free to enter the discussion and ask more or make further comments, since there are clearly some key strategic issues here. And I think that people are looking for political and economic strategies which are centered on hope as well. So we'll take several comments, and please don't hesitate. And of course, most of you have probably not read the book. you want to temper your comments in the light of not having read the book, but you've heard the discussion. So that creates a connection that you can make. Who wants to, please put up your hand. Et sentez-vous libre de poser vos questions en français, vos commentaires également. On va les traduire par le processus de facilitation linguistique. Who wants to move in here? Don't be shy.
Yes, please don't be shy.
And just while we're waiting, John, there isn't a case study of Quebec in the book. So we have the classic English-Canadian treatment of Canada. It's Canada without Quebec, which maybe is sponsored by the PQ. And you can say, well, the data does this, but there have been a number of studies which look at some of the aspects of Quebec public policy and say, well, it has had an impact on inequality, that the patterns are slightly different. Now, Ian might have a different take on this. I'm thinking in particular the impact of, and you can say, well, it's been watered down, but of something like childcare and the childcare policies, which is something that Judy's looked at as well, which increases the participation rate, and it's the lower cost of childcare in Quebec relative to, say, downtown Toronto or Vancouver or Hamilton or wherever else you happen to live. So this isn't something that you have to answer right away, but I'm trying to indicate that people can throw in their questions as they move forward. So please, otherwise we'll have to, great. Jane Stinson, thank you very much. If you want to activate your camera, marvelous.
Hi, nice to see everyone. Thank you. Thank you for such an interesting panel. And I got to say, the quality of discussion is such, I'm a little intimidated to enter it without any preparation and not having read the book. But I'm intrigued to read the book after hearing this discussion. And I guess I thought it seemed from the discussion that, John, your analysis is one of the real strengths of this book. And I think for me, as an organizer, someone who comes out of the labor movement for 30 years, I'm always looking at how do we organize around this? And so maybe by breaking down neoliberalism into some strands or component parts, it helps us with thinking about how do we fight it too. And so that is where I think, how do we fight this? And we talk about fighting neoliberalism, it always feels so overwhelming and big. And so maybe by thinking about these component parts, by thinking about how, current problems are part of this broader, longer term process, and getting current leaders to sort of understand it too. And by leaders, I mean those in the union movement and also political leaders. I think we can't forget the social democratic parties. Thank you, Ian, for raising them and their important role and to what extent they're different and how do we make them different as well, or more different. So yeah, the alternatives piece, I think, is where this leads us to. And I'm not sure that you really discuss that in this book, John. It seems it's much more a great contribution in terms of analysis. But where does it take us in terms of developing alternatives and more than no? I mean, I think no is important to some of the changes that are going on. It's absolutely important. But what, in addition to no, how does this help us sort of develop strategies for alternatives? Thank you.
Thanks so much to Jane Stinson for that question. Over to you, Simon Black.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. My question has to do with how you employ Colin Crouch's term post-democracy in the book. This regime of jobs with inequality or neoliberalism, working people have voted for, at least in the democracies, Western democracies, have voted for governments of various political stripes that have pursued these policies. I think the why they have gets to kind of questions that both Ian and Judy have raised in their questions to you as well, around is it a matter of kind of neoliberalism and cultural hegemony that neoliberalism successfully created kind of new subjectivities amongst people, that they're unable to see their interests, or they see their interests differently from how they should see them? Or is it a question of kind of broader political economy in which the political parties, including center-left or left-wing political parties, are so constrained that they, in terms of their choices and what politics they pursue, that there's no real alternatives, or there haven't been alternatives on offer? And what does Crouch's notion of post-democracy help us do in terms of thinking about this? How working people in the democracies have voted for these regimes, and in that case, how has consent been manufactured? Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Simon Black, and great questions. And if you want to check John's response, then you can use ChatGPT and see what it comes up with relative to what John does. Over to you, Laurel Ritchie.
Yeah, hi, and my thanks too. I certainly appreciate this has been a long time in the coming. There's a tremendous amount of research by the sounds of it. But that, of course, means that it also has a certain timeless quality to it. And I'm wondering if if either you, John, or any of the other respondents want to identify new insights over the last 5 years. And obviously that covers the period of the pandemic and the plague, and what new challenges, what other pieces might be missing, given that this study has extended over a number of years?
Great. We're open to taking other comments and questions as we move. Simon, I'll note you still have your hand up, but in case you want to come in again, you're welcome. Can I also remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and it will make it available on the CRIMT and I believe on the CIRA, Canadian Industrial Relations Association websites in the fullness of time, but also as a reminder to speakers that they're being recorded, which the panelists and the author clearly know already. If no one else wants to come in right away, then John, maybe you can come back on a few of these. And I do want to reinforce that comment made by Judy Fudge of our connectedness to this. I was reading an article in The Guardian this morning about an invasive species in the United Kingdom called Japanese knotweed. And it's the inability of gardeners to get rid of this, and the roots have this incredible structure, and they can lie dormant for 15 years and then be reactivated. And that reminds me a little of our relationship with financialization, as Judy put it. It's the Japanese knotweed problem. So what's our strategic take on this, which I think is linked as well to Jane Stinson's question. So adding more in here, over to you, John.
Yeah, well, my book's about the problems and not necessarily the solutions, but I'm hoping that the discussion of the problems leads to some of the solutions. And I think I'm not alone in this. I mean, you look at what Bernie Sanders and the Socialists of America have been doing, over the past decade or more. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn and the labor movement in behind him for a long time was just beginning to think about how do you sort of raise expectations, how do you get people back involved, right, and how do you begin to sort of put forward a policy that can help organize some of that. Well, I think certainly, the Socialists of America, have been very successful about, taking some of these issues, at a municipal level and at a state level, and have been, organizing and doing new organizing, and talking about, how capitalism is becoming far more unequal and how we have to begin to tackle it much more systematically. And I think, interesting, where you have the most polling that takes place is in the United States, and most people would say, yes, guess what? We want national health care. We want public funding for training. We want lower education fees. We want good jobs. And interesting. interestingly enough, generally you also see in that polling that people, also want, tackle climate change, and they want safe communities, and they want, a clean and sustainable environment for their, their children and their grandchildren. And I think that, I don't see enough of that same polling here in Canada, but my guess is that, in talking to most people, that would be, similarly is what they want. But it's about trying to find those kinds of forces that we can begin to, take people forward and to have that kind of leadership, both in our communities, but also in our trade unions, and also in our politics, and to see, some of those first people, whether it's in, have our own Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, speaking out, and our own Bernie Sanders speaking out in our legislature, suddenly giving people a whole different vision about what the problems are and what the solutions are. So I think those are some of the initial steps that, if you're going to tackle, the nature of inequality and say that we want solutions for it, right? And to talk about, taxing the wealthy, and taxing business, and putting profit windfall taxes. I mean, interestingly enough, even in Great Britain, we have a profit windfall tax, but yet we can't even seem to discuss one here at all in Canada. Even in Europe, they're talking about a minimum corporate tax, but we're still a long ways away from signing anything like that. But so, those first steps for organizing are to sort of try and get, people, as Laurel mentioned, right, try to get a sense about, what the problems are and what some of the solutions are. And I hope that, in terms of trying to discuss that, we can then begin to change some of what Simon has said is subjectivities. But the other part of post-democracy, of course, is not just subjectivities, right? It's the fact that you're trying to mobilize those people who are, been either marginalized out of politics or become completely distrustful of politics. I think one of my sort of, hobby horses is the fact that, generally these days, only 50% of the population in Canada is voting. And given the nature of our first past the post system, you actually only need about 20% of the voting public to actually win. And you can devise all of your policies, and you can cater towards that 20% and use social media to help mobilize them, and win office. Most recently, I think Doug Ford was elected generally, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around 22% of Ontarians actually voted for him, and he has a majority government that moves forward. But however depressing that is, that's also a huge opportunity. You only need 22%, a fifth, right? We need to sort of mobilize and organize. Can we get the leaders that are going to be able to, step forward in our communities and our cities? Can we get some of those new activists, elected to our social democratic parties and the NDP or to the PQ or to others, right? So that they're going to be able to take that kind of new leadership role and begin to change some of those parties. I think those are the big questions that I'm trying to tackle with going forward. And in terms of challenges that, aren't in the book, well, the climate crisis is the biggest one, right? And it's a hammer over all of our heads. Trying to think about what the solutions are and how we try to get those solutions quickly and at scale, I think is one of the big mobilizing issues. And it's also one of the biggest opportunities we have as well in terms of trying to build a renewable economy that's going to benefit everybody and create new shared prosperity. And that's a model I think that we can begin to take forward, not only as labor activists, but also as community people and as family members and as parents, that we need a sustainable economy for all of that. And we need to make sure it's an economy that all are going to benefit from. And I think that might be the way that we can all begin to sort of move forward and take some of those initial steps.
Now, I don't know whether anyone else wants to come in. I see that Jim Stanford is trying to start a political movement in favor of Mathieu Dupuis, perhaps unbeknownst to him, but we'll leave that. We have an incredibly resourceful and astute audience here, and I am going to ask the critics for their takeaway from this discussion. But does anyone else want to come in with their takeaway from the discussion? Not necessarily inviting a comment from John or a question to John, but just to anything you want to take away from this discussion. And you're forewarned, Judy, Ian, and Jim, that the last word is going to go to you. So going once, going twice, any hands up? Over to you, Judy. What's your takeaway from this discussion?
I think that John's book provides the basis for understanding why a kind of vicious populism has sprouted at the beginning of the 2020s. And I do think that's new. So that goes to Laurel's question. And the sad thing is that neoliberalism is not being replaced by a resurgent social democracy, nor a transformative anti-capitalist politics, but by a kind of nostalgia which ignores the exclusion. So it's a looking back at the past and not understanding. And that, I think, is the benefit of John's book, is it explains why it is that this kind of populism is so powerful.
Thank you very much, Judy Fudge at the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. Over to you, Ian MacDonald at the School of Industrial Relations at Université de Montréal.
Well, this is an impossible task. I couldn't sum this up. John's right. The big challenge that's not in the book is the climate crisis. And I think Jim, you're right that we might be headed for something worse. Perhaps the next book, John, is Jobless with Inequality. And Judy, I share your concerns about the failure of social democracy being replaced by the far right and fascism. That's what's happening across the pond. That's what's going to happen here. So we need to be, I think we need to come up with a clear, popular program that will mobilize 25%. Nationalize the banks, use savings to finance the green transition with increased worker power and participation at the plant level. That's what I modestly propose. Something understandable, simple, and popular.
Thank you, Ian MacDonald at Université de Montréal, for your modest proposal. Terrific. And over to you, Jim Stanford, for the last word, since we'll spare John from having to speak once again, but all want to thank him. Jim Stanford.
Thank you, Gregor. I was just struck when John was saying we needed our own Bernie Sanders, our own AOC, and I'm looking at Matthew Dupuis on the screen, who did take the plunge to run for office and knows all about financialization. And we do actually have some really great candidates and progressive activists in different movements, electoral and non-electoral. I guess my big takeaway from the discussion, Gregor, I'm sure others feel this, is just feeling a bit daunted by the challenge of organizing the resistance to all this. I think we agree on the analysis of what we're up against, and John's book is a tremendous contribution to that, especially, as I mentioned, the multidimensional aspect, pulling these different strands together. And I think that we have a sense of the solutions of what the alternatives are going to be. I don't think we're short on that. I think what we are missing is the capacity to talk to our coworkers and our neighbors and other people in society and convince them that something better is possible, and then organize it. And I think we have an idea of how that has to happen. It has to be a coalition. It has to be a multi-issue, inclusive movement. The labor movement, the organized labor movement, despite its warts, has to be at the center of it, and it has to start with immediate demands, but informed by a bigger picture analysis of what's going on. So that is what we're up against, and it's a big challenge, but our world depends on it. There's no doubt about it. So thank you very much, John, for your contribution to helping us understand what has to be done.
Well, I know, John, that many people have expressed their interest in reading the book. Hopefully this sparks greater interest, and I believe that we'll need a return to Jobs with Inequality webinar to talk more about the pathways to the future, the political and research challenges that this involves. Clearly, we've had a great discussion today with wonderful contributions from Judy Fudge at McMaster University, Ian MacDonald at Université de Montréal, Jim Stanford at the Center for Future Work, and not least, and most of all, John Peters, who is teaching right now at the University of Toronto, the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, is an associated professor at Université de Montréal, and importantly, working with blue-green ideas on the green transition and in many different incarnations with different people in this Zoom room. So thank you very much for your contribution, John Peters. We're really grateful for you having done this and having taken it forward. So thank you.
Right. And thank you to Gregor and to Nicola and the CRIMT team. And thank you for, again, to Judy and Jim and Ian and all the participants here today for the seminar. Great for you to join us today.